Feature Friday, all my quilting friends. Thank you for joining us in my quilting studio. We appreciate y'all being here. I have been quilting away on my little quilt, and I've been doing an edge-to-edge design, and I've been using the nesting feature. And I thought, everybody's seen this nesting feature a couple different times. There's no need for me to show y'all how to use this. And then I thought, wait a minute. I need to show them this example of using the nesting feature, because with the particular design that I'm using, it doesn't automatically nest perfectly, and I'm having to move my nesting into a better position so that it looks nicer. So I thought I would hop on and do a Feature Friday video so that you can see me actually moving my design into place in the nesting feature. So we're going to go ahead and switch around and do that. I've just finished a row, and we're going to nest together and use that move feature within the nesting. I'm going to turn y'all around. So here we have the quilt I've been working on, and you can see I've got plenty of quilting on here. I've got this big swirly design, and I've ended a row over here, and I've already pulled up my bobbin thread and clipped off my tail, so I am ready to nest. If we come up to my robotics screen, you can see that I am in my home screen. My little house is highlighted up here on the left-hand side. The row you see in my layout box here is the row that was just stitched, and we are ready to nest. So my nesting features here on the right-hand side of my display looks like a bunch of little hearts together. So we can go ahead and hit our nesting feature. And when we do that, we are asked to select and mark our nesting point. And then we've got our check mark over here when we do that. I'm going to move my machine into the point where I've been using to nest all of my rows, and I usually like to use a low point in my design as opposed to a high point in my design. So a high point in the design would be like this arc that I've got here, but I've got stitching lower than that, and my lowest point is kind of the bottom of this curve. So I'm going to use that as my nesting point. For me, I like to bring my needle, hover it over one of the stitches in that low point, and lower my needle into my quilt top. Now, if you are uncomfortable with putting your needle in your fabric for this process, that's okay. You can always take a chalk pencil or a marking pen that you're comfortable using and just mark that with a marking pencil instead of putting your needle in the fabric. You do what you're more comfortable with. Just remember, if you're using a marking pencil or a chalk pencil or a marking pen, make sure it's something that you've used before and you're comfortable with. That way you know it's going to come off of your fabric when you're finished. You don't want any marks left behind on your quilt top. So I've got my needle in my fabric, which is marking my nesting point. So now that I've selected and marked my nesting point, I'm going to hit the green check mark on the right-hand side of my screen. Now my robotics is telling me to roll my quilt. So I'm going to come down here and release my roller bars so that I can roll my quilt. And I'm going to go nice and slow because I have my needle down in that fabric. I don't want to put any extra tension on that point where my needle is in the quilt top. I don't want to risk stretching it or tearing it at all. So I'm just going to go nice and easy. I do want to make sure I leave a space behind my needle and the head of my machine so I don't actually run into my back bars when I'm stitching. So I think I'm good here. I'm going to lock my back bar into place, give my front bar a little roll forward, and lock that into place. So now that I've got that all rolled, I'm going to go ahead and hit my green check mark. Now my robotics is telling me to move my machine to my nesting point. Now, because I have my needle in my fabric, I'm already in my nesting point. But if you used a marking tool to mark your nesting point, you would go ahead and put your machine right over that spot that you had marked. So because I'm there, I'm going to go ahead and hit my green check mark. Now that I've done that, you can see that the row that I've stitched out already and just rolled with the quilt is in gray, and the new row that my Robotics wants to stitch is in the black. But if we get nice and close here, you can see there's quite a bit of a gap between the two rows, and that's a little bit more than I want. So I need to close that gap a little bit, and I'm going to use my move function to do that. The first thing I need to do though is get my needle out of my fabric. So I'm going to raise my needle so it's no longer in my quilt. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use my little arrow here. My arrow button is going to allow me to grab onto my handlebars and move my rows by moving my machine. So I'm going to hit my little arrows here that cross each other, and when I highlight that, I can now move my machine with my handlebars, and if I push away from me, it's going to move these rows together. If I pull my machine towards me, it's going to pull the rows apart. So I'll show you. I'm going to pull my machine towards me, and my rows are getting further apart. But I need those rows closer together, so I'm going to push the machine away from me towards my back bar, and I'm going to close that gap a little bit and get a better nested set of rows. I kind of want to mimic the space that's between those swirls with my nesting. So I want to kind of eyeball that and get them spaced out kind of the same. This is a little bit fiddly and of course goes along with your preference, but I think that looks pretty good. I think I've got things evenly spaced and it looks cohesive with the design. So I'm going to go ahead and hit my green check mark. And now it says nesting complete, and this is the next row that I'm going to stitch. So you can see that that was pretty easy just by hitting that cross arrows and moving my machine head, that I could get that into place and better nested. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this out by hitting my green button up here. And I always get my pop-up box telling me it's going to go to the start of my pattern, which is my little green dot over here, and verify that my needle's up. You always want to do that when you've been putting your needle down in your fabric to mark your nesting point. You always want to double check. So my needle is up, so I can hit my green check mark, and my robotic system will move over to the starting point of my pattern, and it will get me going. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate y'all being here. I think it was an important thing to show you guys because most of the time the robotics does a great job of nesting your designs. But every now and then you've got a big design that's got a lot of dips and curves in it, and you might need to just move it a little bit while you're using your nesting feature. So that's a great way to do that if you haven't done that when you actually added your pattern into your pattern box in the first place. Since I had a single row design, I didn't have multiple pattern rows that I added and nested in the first place. This was just one single row that I'm stitching out one at a time. So I'm nesting one at a time, and I have to close that gap each time I nest. I hope that was helpful for you guys. I know that it was something that I had to learn how to do first time that I ended up with rows that were a little too gappy between them. So take your time. Use your nesting feature, and if you have to adjust a little bit, go ahead and do so. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.